Lone orphan who rescued a stranded botanist and wounded tracker. 6 days later, 100 Arapaho came. The sun-scorched wasteland was a merciless anvil, a place of desperation, futility, and crushing silence. Erik Hansen, a man of science, knelt beside his still companion Aiyana, his hands raw from digging for water that wasn't there. His vast knowledge of botany, once a source of pride, now felt like a cruel joke. He was the white medicine man, the savior who had once stared down a plague and won using nothing but forest leaves and boiled roots. He had saved an entire Arapaho village. Now he couldn't even save himself. His hope was played out. As his vision blurred, a shape emerged from the heat haze. A child. A small silent girl watching him from the rocks with eyes that held no pity. She wasn't a mirage. She was a judgment. But in a land where saviors die of thirst, what does salvation look like? The sun was a hammer, and the land was an anvil. Erik Hansen felt each blow a rhythm of heat and despair that pounded against his skull. The world had bleached itself of color, leaving only the blinding white of the salt flats and the brittle, angry ochre of cracked earth. He, a man of science, a botanist who could name every grass and flower from the fjords of Norway to the forests of Minnesota, was now a stranger in a land that had forgotten how to live. His knowledge was a useless weight in his pocket. Beside him, Aiyana stumbled. Her strength, which had always seemed as boundless as the plains themselves, was finally fraying. Her dark hair, usually a neat braid, was a tangled mess, and her lips were the color of the dust that coated them. She was his guide, his friend, the keeper of a wisdom that stretched back 1,000 years. But even her ancestors were silent in this God-forsaken place. "The spirits have left this land." She whispered, her voice a dry rasp like leaves skittering across stone. "There is nothing here for us, Erik. Only sun and silence." He reached for her arm, his own hand trembling. "We rest. Just for a moment." They collapsed in the scant shade of a skeletal mesquite tree, its shadow a cruel mockery of relief. Erik's mind, a desperate engine, churned through his memories of textbooks and lectures. Opuntia humifusa, the prickly pear. Its pads held water, but the few he had found were shriveled and dead, their flesh a dry, fibrous pulp. He had once saved an entire Arapaho village from a plague with nothing but boiled roots and the steady hand of a physician. They called him the White Medicine Man. A savior. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, drier than the dust itself. A savior dying of thirst. He looked at Aiyana. She had her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. In her hand, she clutched a single smooth stone, a talisman from her home. He had failed her. His science, his logic, his careful catalogued world, it all meant nothing here. The wilderness did not care for Latin names. It demanded a different kind of tribute. "Aiyana," he began, his own voice cracking. "The fault is mine. I led us into this." "No," she interrupted, her eyes fluttering open. They were still fierce. "We walk this path together. We meet the end together." She held out her waterskin, its sides collapsed and empty. A single dark drop clung to the leather nozzle. She offered it to him. He gently pushed it back. "No, you." His words died in his throat. Something was watching them. On a low ridge, not 50 yards away, a figure stood. It was small, impossibly thin, a stick figure drawn against the shimmering heat. It was a child. A girl with a tangle of black hair and a tattered deerskin dress. She stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on them, her expression not of curiosity or fear, but of a quiet, unnerving assessment. She looked like a part of the landscape itself, a spirit of the dust given form. Aiyana saw her too. She stiffened, her hand tightening on her stone. A lone child in this wasteland was a bad omen. A ghost. "Stay back." Aiyana warned, her voice a low growl meant more for the spirits than for the child. But the girl did not move. She simply watched as Erik's head slumped forward as the last of his strength gave out. She watched as Aiyana cradled his head in her lap, her own body trembling with exhaustion. She watched them surrender. The sun beat down. The silence was absolute. Then the child moved. She did not run. She did not shout. She walked toward them, her bare feet making no sound on the hard-baked earth. She stopped a few feet away, her dark eyes taking in their cracked lips, their sunken cheeks, the utter finality of their situation. This was Rosa, a 9-year-old orphan who knew only this single patch of hell. And this was her kingdom. Erik drifted in a haze of heat and fading light. He was vaguely aware of the girl's presence, a small, dark shape against the blinding glare. He felt Aiyana shift her body, a weak but determined shield over him. He heard her whisper a Kiowa prayer for the journey to the spirit world. This was the end. A quiet, undignified death on an unforgiving patch of earth. But the child Rosa did not approach them. She did something far stranger. She knelt, turning her back to them, and pressed her ear flat against the scorching ground. Her eyes closed. Her small body was perfectly still, a tiny seismograph, listening for a tremor no one else could feel. She held the position for a long, silent minute, a priestess consulting her oracle of dust and stone. Aiyana watched, her suspicion warring with a sliver of desperate curiosity. What was the child doing? There was no sound but the faint whisper of the hot wind. No life. No hope. Then Rosa stood up. She looked at Aiyana, and for the first time she acted. She did not speak. She simply pointed. Not toward the distant hazy mountains where shade might lie. Not toward the canyons where a storm might have left a hidden pool. She pointed toward an empty, sun-blasted flat, a stretch of ground even more desolate than where they lay. It was madness. "There is nothing there," Aiyana rasped, shaking her head. "Child, you are mistaken." Rosa's expression did not change. She simply pointed again, more insistently this time. Then she took a few steps in that direction, stopped, and looked back, her gaze a silent, unwavering command. A choice had to be made. To die here in the shadow of this dead tree, or to follow a silent, half-wild child on a fool's errand. Aiyana looked down at Erik. His breathing was barely a flutter. His skin was pale under his sun-darkened complexion. She saw the man who had sat with her people, who had learned their stories, who had treated her not as a savage, but as an equal. The man who had saved so many, and who now lay dying. She would not let him die here, not without one last desperate gamble. "Erik," she said, her voice a surge of renewed, impossible strength. "Erik, we must go. Get up." The journey was an eternity of torment. With Aiyana on one side and the small, surprisingly strong child on the other, they half-dragged, half-carried Erik across the barren flat. His feet scuffed the ground, his head lolled. Every step was a monumental effort. The sun was relentless. The landscape was a blur of shimmering heat. Aiyana's logical mind, the mind of a seasoned guide, screamed that this was wrong. They were walking deeper into the wasteland, away from any landmark, any sign of life. They were following the whims of a child who was likely mad from solitude and sun. But she kept going. She trusted the child's certainty. It was a strange, primal knowledge that defied all the lessons her own people had taught her. Finally, Rosa stopped. They were in the middle of nowhere, a slight depression in the earth surrounded by a few heat-blasted rocks. There was nothing, not a single blade of grass, not even a hardy weed. "Here," Aiyana breathed, her hope finally crumbling into dust. "There is nothing here." Rosa ignored her. She fell to her knees and began to dig, not with a tool, but with her bare hands, her small fingers clawing at the baked, concrete-hard surface of the earth. It seemed a futile, heartbreaking act. Erik, roused to a moment of lucidity, watched her. "It's no use," he murmured, his scientific mind cataloging the failure. "The geology, the aridity. It's impossible." Aiyana knelt beside the child, her heart aching with pity. "Little one, stop," she said gently. "Save your strength." Rosa did not stop. She dug with a fierce, silent determination, her small body rocking with the effort. She dug past the dry gray topsoil. And then something changed. The dust her fingers threw back was no longer gray. It was dark. It was damp. Aiyana's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer. A faint, cool, earthy smell rose from the small hole. The smell of life. Rosa's fingers broke through. It was not a gush. It was a miracle. A slow, impossible seep of clear, clean water welling up from the dark, damp soil. It pooled in the bottom of the hole, a shimmering jewel in the dust. An underground spring. A secret vein of life that only this child, this spirit of the wasteland, knew to find. For a moment, no one moved. They simply stared at the impossible gift. Then Aiyana let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She scooped the water in her cupped hands, the coolness a shocking, exquisite balm, and brought it to Erik's lips. He drank. The water was life. It was a sacrament. It washed the dust from his throat and the despair from his soul. He drank, and then Aiyana drank, and then they gave more to Rosa, whose small, solemn face showed the first flicker of a smile. The white medicine man and the wise Kiowa guide, two people of immense knowledge and strength, had been led from the brink of death by a silent orphan with dirt under her fingernails. In the heart of the great silent wasteland, they had been saved not by science or tradition, but by a whisper from the earth heard only by a child. The first day by the spring was a blur of life returning. The water, cool and sweet, was a constant prayer on their lips. They did not speak much. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. Instead, they existed in a state of profound shared gratitude. The world, which had been a vast, hostile expanse, had shrunk to the size of this small, damp patch of earth. It was their sanctuary. It was their universe. A new dynamic formed, silent and immediate. Erik, the man of letters and laws of nature, and Aiyana, the woman of stars and ancient paths, were no longer the leaders of this small expedition. They were the followers. Their guide was now a 9-year-old girl who spoke more with her eyes than with her voice. They watched her fascinated. Rosa moved with a quiet efficiency that belied her age. She showed them how to dig the spring wider without collapsing its delicate structure. From a pouch at her hip, she produced a small piece of flint and a strip of dried jerky, which she shared without a word, dividing the meager portion into 3 equal parts. It was a gesture of such simple, profound hospitality that it brought tears to Aiyana's eyes. "She has survived here alone," Aiyana whispered to Erik as they watched Rosa expertly chip at the flint. "For how long, I cannot imagine." Erik nodded, his scientific mind humbled. "Her knowledge is not of a tribe, but of a territory. A specific, brutal territory. She knows its secrets because her life has depended on them." He looked at the arid landscape stretching out from their small oasis. "I can analyze the soil, I can explain the hydrostatic pressure that creates this spring. My science can tell me what it is, but it could never have told me where." That evening, as the brutal sun finally relented, a fragile trust began to form. Erik, using the gentle, patient tone he reserved for frightened animals and sick children, tried to speak to Rosa. "Your name is Rosa?" he asked softly. The girl flinched at the direct question, her eyes darting away. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "That is a beautiful name," he continued. "It means rose, in a language from far away. A flower." Rosa looked at him then, a flicker of curiosity in her dark eyes. She pointed a small dusty finger at a withered, thorny bush clinging to life near a rock. "No," Erik smiled gently. "Not that kind. A different kind, with soft petals, red and white and yellow." It was Aiyana who bridged the true gap. She did not use words. She sat near Rosa and began to weave a small figure from a few tough strands of grass, her fingers moving with practiced grace. She made a tiny bird, then offered it to the girl. Rosa hesitated, then took the small token, her fingers tracing its shape. It was a shared moment of creation, a silent conversation in the language of art and patience. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Their strength returned slowly. Erik's scientific curiosity resurfaced, and he began to study the unique ecosystem of their small sanctuary, cataloging the insects and hardy plants that survived here. Aiyana taught Rosa how to read the clouds for signs of rain, a piece of her own ancestral knowledge. And Rosa, in turn, showed them her world. She led them to a hidden patch of bitter roots that, when boiled, became edible. She showed them which rocks held the most warmth after the sun went down. On the third night by the spring, as the desert chill began to creep in, and the stars emerged sharp against the vast black canvas of the sky, the three of them sat huddled around a small fire. Strength had returned to Erik and Aiyana, enough for them to share quiet stories of the wider world beyond. But Rosa remained silent, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, deep and unreadable. After she was sure the two adults were no longer a threat, Rosa retrieved a secret treasure from the small pouch at her hip. It was not a sharp knife or a piece of flint, but something soft and fragile. It was a scrap of faded blue calico, soft from being handled too much. The fabric was tattered at the edges, but surprisingly clean. In one corner, a small flower had been clumsily embroidered with white thread, a few of the stitches having come loose. Aiyana, with her innate sensitivity, did not ask directly. She simply smiled and said softly in Kiowa, a language of gentle melodies, "That is a beautiful piece of the blue sky, little one." Rosa did not reply. Instead, she did something that made Erik's and Aiyana's hearts ache. She pressed the scrap of cloth to her cheek, her eyes closing, and took a deep breath as if trying to recall a scent that had long since faded into the air. A quiet, broken melody escaped her lips. It was not a song, but the fragment of a lullaby, a simple tune any mother might sing to her child. Erik and Aiyana fell silent. No words were needed. They understood. They understood that she had not always been alone. That scrap of cloth was all that was left of a mother. That lullaby was all that was left of a family. They saw the full picture of her loss and the extraordinary resilience that had allowed her to survive alone in this dead land. Erik the physician saw a deep wound of the soul that needed healing. Aiyana, the protector, saw a spirit that needed sheltering. That night, by the flickering fire, they were no longer three strangers surviving. They had become companions and lost guardians of a small and sacred memory. The invisible bond between them had been tied tighter than ever before. They became a family. A strange, silent, sunburnt family of three, bound by the shared miracle of a secret spring. On the morning of the sixth day, the peace was broken. Aiyana was the first to sense it. She stood suddenly, her head cocked, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Someone is coming," she said, her voice low and tense. Erik followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing but the endless shimmering expanse. Then he saw it. A faint plume of dust rising against the clear blue sky. It was not the random swirl of a dust devil. It was moving with purpose. It was moving toward them. The sanctuary they had found, their small pocket of life in the midst of death, was about to be discovered. The fear which had receded with the return of their strength came rushing back, cold and sharp. They were still exposed, still vulnerable, and the approaching dust cloud could mean anything. It could be salvation, or it could be the end they had only temporarily postponed. Instinct took over. Aiyana grabbed Rosa, pulling the child behind her body becoming a shield. Erik, his strength mostly returned, stood beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of the large knife at his belt. His mind raced. Who could it be? Outlaws, a cavalry patrol? Neither option felt safe. In this land, a stranger was a threat until proven otherwise. The plume of dust grew, resolving itself into distinct shapes. Riders. At least half a dozen of them, their forms dark against the glare. They rode with the easy, powerful grace of men born to the saddle. As they drew closer, Erik could make out the details. They were not white men. They were warriors. Their long hair braided their faces, painted not for war, but with the solemn markings of a ceremonial purpose. On their lances, eagle feathers fluttered in the wind. Aiyana let out a soft gasp beside him. "Arapaho," she breathed. The lead rider held up a hand, and the entire party came to a halt about 100 yards from the spring. He dismounted a tall, powerfully built man with a face like carved granite. His eyes, dark and intelligent, held a profound gravity. He carried no rifle, only a long, unadorned staff. He began to walk toward them alone. It was a sign of peace. But the tension in Erik's shoulders did not lessen. The warrior stopped 10 feet away. His gaze swept over their small camp, taking in the scene, the two adults weary but alive, and the small, half-hidden child. His eyes lingered on Erik, a flicker of recognition, of something akin to awe in their depths. "We have been searching for you, white medicine man," the warrior said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble, his English careful and deliberate. Erik stared stunned into silence. White medicine man. The name they had given him months ago in a village ravaged by sickness. How did you know we were here?" Aiyana asked, her voice tight with suspicion, stepping slightly in front of Erik. The warrior's gaze shifted to her, and he gave a slow, respectful nod. "The wind carries news," he said. "And the men at the Dry River trading post carry worries. They said the man who saved their children from the coughing sickness had not arrived. They said you had walked into the land where spirits sleep. Our elders said a debt of life cannot be left unpaid." The words struck Erik with the force of a physical blow. A debt. They had come looking for him. Not as enemies, but as allies. As saviors returning a favor he had long since thought forgotten. He looked at Aiyana, whose face was a mask of stunned disbelief. He looked at Rosa, who peeked out from behind Aiyana's legs, her fear slowly being replaced by a child's natural curiosity. He looked at the proud warrior standing before him, a living testament to a kindness he had offered out of simple duty. "We heard you were lost." The Arapaho leader continued, his voice softening with something that sounded like relief. "We did not know if we would find you alive. It seems the spirits of this land have watched over you." He glanced at Rosa. "And have sent you a guide." Erik finally found his voice a rough, emotional rasp. We were close to the end. This child, she saved us." The warrior nodded again, a deep understanding in his eyes. "The Great Spirit works in ways we do not always see. A life given is a life returned. That is the law of the earth." He turned and raised his hand, signaling to his men. They began to dismount, unloading supplies from their horses. Not weapons, but gifts. Heavy waterskins, bundles of smoked meat, and leather pouches that Erik knew with a sudden heart-stopping certainty contained the very herbs he had used to heal their people. The circle was closing. The kindness he had sown in a time of plague was now being returned to him in a time of drought. He, the savior, had been saved, and the currency of his rescue was not gold or power, but a simple, profound, and unbreakable debt of gratitude. The Arapaho warrior, whose name was Standing Bear, gestured to the pouches his men were laying on the ground. "A gift," he said, "so that the white medicine man may continue his work." Erik stared at the familiar dried leaves and roots, and the present moment dissolved. The scent of the herbs, sharp and earthy, was a key that unlocked a memory, and he was no longer standing by a secret spring, but in a village shrouded in fear and the sound of rattling coughs. 4 months earlier, the village of the Arapaho had not been a place of life. It was a place of waiting, waiting for death. The great coughing sickness had swept through the camp like a phantom, stealing the breath from the old and the very young. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and sickness, and the only constant sound was the dry, hacking cough that echoed from teepee to teepee. Their own medicine men had tried everything, their sacred songs and poultices powerless against this new invisible enemy. Erik and Aiyana had stumbled upon it by chance, seeking to trade for fresh supplies on their journey east. They had been met not with welcome, but with the wary, grief-stricken eyes of a people watching their future die. Aiyana, speaking in the shared sign language of the plains, had learned the extent of the plague. "They are losing their children, Erik," she had told him, her own voice thick with sorrow. "And their elders, their past and their future are being taken at once." Something inside Erik, the physician he had tried to leave behind in the structured world of Europe, stirred. He was a botanist, now a man of quiet observation. But he could not turn his back on this. He could not simply observe death. "Let me see them." He had set his voice firm with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. The Arapaho were suspicious. A white man offering medicine. It was a story they had heard before, one that often ended in betrayal. But their desperation was greater than their distrust. The chief, a weary man named Black Kettle, had led him to the first teepee. Inside, a small child lay on a buffalo robe, her small body racked with fever, her breath a shallow, painful rasp. Erik knelt, his movements gentle, his hands sure. He listened to her chest, felt her pulse. It was a severe bronchitis bordering on pneumonia. Deadly, but not invincible. He walked out of the teepee and into the nearby woods, Aiyana at his side. His botanist's eyes scanned the flora not for rare specimens, but for an arsenal. He found it. The inner bark of the wild cherry, a powerful cough suppressant. The leaves of the mullein plant, a natural expectorant to clear the lungs. The bark of the willow tree, a source of salicin, the foundation of aspirin to fight the fever. These were plants the Arapaho knew, but they had never combined them in this way. Erik's science was not a replacement for their wisdom. It was a complement to it. The work was relentless. For days, he and Aiyana became a blur of motion. Erik directed the gathering and preparation, his knowledge of dosages and chemistry precise. He crushed bark into fine powders, steeped leaves into bitter, steaming teas. Aiyana was the bridge. She translated his instructions, calmed the frightened mothers, and persuaded the skeptical warriors to trust the strange white man's methods. She explained that his medicine was not a challenge to their spirits, but another gift from the earth, interpreted in a different way. The turning point came with Black Kettle's own granddaughter, the very child Erik had first examined. She had been fading, her breath all but gone. Erik worked through the night administering the warm tea, applying a warm poultice of mullein leaves to her tiny chest. Aiyana sat with the family, her quiet, strong presence a comfort in the face of their grief. Toward dawn, the child's fever broke. Her coughing subsided and her breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of healing sleep. The news spread through the village like a cleansing fire. The white medicine man was real. His magic was strong. One by one, he treated them. The elders, their wrinkled faces etched with gratitude. The children, their laughter slowly returning to the silent village. He did not lose a single patient after his arrival. He had stared down the plague, and with the help of the earth and his own forgotten skills, he had won. When it was time for them to leave, the entire village had gathered. Black Kettle had stood before him. "You have given us back our lives," the chief had said, his voice thick with emotion. "There is no gift that can repay such a debt. But know this the Arapaho do not forget. Your name will be honored in our songs. If ever you are in need, the mountains will hear it, and we will come." The present. Erik's eyes refocused on Standing Bear, on the gifts of life laid at his feet. The memory was so vivid it felt as if it had happened only yesterday. He had not thought of their promise as a literal debt. It had been a turn of phrase, a moment of heartfelt gratitude, but he had been wrong. To them, it was a sacred vow, a life for a life. A circle. He looked at the herbs, at the water, at the food. He looked at the proud, solemn faces of the warriors who had ridden into the wasteland to find him. Then he looked at Rosa, the small, silent child who had been the first link in this impossible chain of kindness. The savior saved by a ghost. The ghost saved by a debt. The debt repaid in the heart of nowhere. He finally understood. The law of the earth was not about science or spirits. It was about connection. It was about the circles you create, the kindness you sow, never knowing when or how it will come back to you, a spring of water in a barren land. A profound, humbling gratitude washed over Erik, leaving him speechless. He looked at the gifts, then at the men who brought them, and finally his gaze settled on Rosa, who was still half hidden behind Aiyana, watching the proceedings with wide, solemn eyes. A future which just days ago had been an impossibility now stretched before him, clear and undeniable. But it was a future with a question mark at its center. "We thank you, Standing Bear." Aiyana said, her voice filled with a quiet, formal grace that Erik lacked in that moment. "You have honored your word. You have honored us." Standing Bear inclined his head. "It is the way. We will escort you from this place, take you to the trading post at Dry River." It was an offer of salvation, a return to the world they knew. But Erik looked at Rosa, at the small, fierce survivor who belonged to no one but this harsh land. They couldn't just leave her. To do so would be to break the very circle of kindness that had just saved them. He knelt so his eyes were level with the child's. "Rosa," he said softly, his voice gentle, "we are leaving this place. The Arapaho will take us to a town, with many people, with food and shelter." He paused, the next words feeling heavier than any he had ever spoken. "We want you to come with us." Rosa stared at him, her dark eyes unblinking. She looked from Erik's earnest face to Aiyana's warm, encouraging smile. She had known nothing but solitude, nothing but the harsh laws of survival. The concept of a town, of a home, of "with us," was as foreign as the languages they spoke. Aiyana knelt beside Erik. She held out the small woven grass bird she had made for Rosa days before. "We will be your people now," she said in Kiowa, her tone a soft melody. "You will not be alone." Rosa looked at the bird in Aiyana's hand, then back at the two adults kneeling before her. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. She did not speak. She did not nod. She simply reached out a small, dusty hand and placed it in Erik's. It was a gesture more powerful than any vow, an acceptance, a beginning. Standing Bear and his warriors watched the silent exchange, their stoic faces breaking into soft smiles. They understood. A new family had just been forged in the heart of the wasteland. The journey out was not a desperate flight, but a stately procession. The Arapaho warriors rode as an honor guard, their presence a shield against the harshness of the land. Rosa, who had never ridden a horse, was seated gently in front of Erik, her small hands clutching the pommel of his saddle, her back pressed against the steady warmth of his chest. She was rigid at first, a small, frightened bird, but as the miles passed, she slowly began to relax her head, eventually coming to rest against him as she slept. Aiyana rode beside them, a quiet, peaceful smile on her face. She looked at Erik, at the sleeping child he held so carefully, and her gaze was full of a deep, abiding warmth. They had walked into the wasteland as two friends, a botanist and a guide. They were leaving as three: a scholar, a warrior, and a wild rose, a family born not of blood, but of a shared miracle. As they crested the final ridge, leaving the sun-scorched flats behind them, Erik looked back one last time. The land was still vast, still empty, still unforgiving. But it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a crucible. A place where a savior had been humbled, where a debt had been paid, and where a small lost girl had led them all back to the spring of life. The circle was complete.